sun blazed overhead, casting a golden hue over the quaint seaside town of Harborview. It was the 4th of July, a day of celebration and fireworks, yet a palpable tension hung in the air as guests arrived at the grand mansion of Mr. Theodore Crane, a wealthy industrialist known for his lavish parties and secretive demeanor. Among the invitees were 8 individuals from various walks of life, each receiving an ornate invitation that promised an evening of festivities and intrigue. They gathered in the opulent foyer of Crane Manor, exchanging polite nods and cautious smiles as they awaited their host's arrival. There was Dr. Emily Hawthorne, a renowned psychiatrist with a keen eye for human behavior, Mr. Jameson Ford, a dashing young actor with a penchant for charm and mystery novels, Mrs. Evelyn Banks, a widowed socialite with a sharp wit and a collection of scandalous secrets, Professor Gregory Stone, an esteemed archaeologist with a passion for ancient artifacts and hidden truths, Miss Abigail Blight, a talented pianist with a haunting past and a quiet demeanor, Mr. Thomas Reed, a reclusive author known for his dark and brooding novels, Mrs. Maggie Dean, a philanthropist with a mysterious fortune and a calculating gaze, and Detective Samuel Beckett, a retired investigator with a reputation for solving the most perplexing cases. As the clock struck 6, the imposing figure of Mr. Crane descended the grand staircase, his presence commanding attention. With a warm smile, he greeted his guests and invited them to join him in the parlor for cocktails before dinner. "I trust you all received my invitation with the promise of a memorable evening," Crane began, his voice resonating through the room. "Tonight we celebrate not only the birth of our nation, but also the bonds that unite us. Please enjoy the festivities and indulge in the pleasures of my home." With that, the guests mingled in the opulent parlor, sipping champagne and exchanging polite conversation, while the sounds of the pianist filled the air with soft melodies. But beneath the veneer of elegance and camaraderie, a shadow of suspicion lingered, a feeling that this evening held secrets waiting to be unraveled. As the evening progressed, tension simmered beneath the surface as the guests enjoyed a sumptuous dinner in the mansion's grand dining hall. The atmosphere was jovial, yet tinged with an undercurrent of unease, amplified by the distant rumble of thunder and flashes of lightning on the horizon. Detective Samuel Beckett observed the interactions with a keen eye, noting the subtle dynamics and hidden agendas among the eclectic group. Mrs. Evelyn Banks engaged in animated conversation with Professor Gregory Stone, their debate on ancient civilizations masking a deeper exchange of veiled insults. Meanwhile, Dr. Emily Hawthorne observed Mr. Thomas Reed with a thoughtful gaze, her curiosity piqued by the enigmatic author's quiet demeanor. As dessert was served, a decadent chocolate torch, the lights flickered momentarily before plunging the room into darkness. Murmurs of surprise filled the air, followed by nervous laughter as the storm outside intensified. Mr. Crane apologized for the inconvenience, assuring his guests that the power outage was merely a temporary setback. But when the lights flickered back on, a scream shattered the fragile peace. The guests rushed to the source of the scream, the conservatory, where Miss Abigail Blight stood frozen in shock, her eyes wide with horror. Lying amidst a bed of exotic flowers was Mr. Jameson Ford, his handsome face twisted in agony, a single red rose clenched in his lifeless hand. Detective Beckett knelt beside the body, his trained eyes scanning the scene for clues. The room was pristine, save for the overturned vase of lilies and the faint scent of bitter almonds that hung in the air, an ominous sign that sent a chill down his spine. "He's been poisoned," Dr. Hawthorne stated grimly, his professional demeanor masking a flicker of concern. "The scent? It's cyanide." Mrs. Maggie Dean gasped, clutching her pearls as she glanced around the room with wide eyes. But who would? Why would anyone?" Professor Stone stepped forward, his brow furrowed in thought. "It appears we have a murderer in our midst," he stated, his voice steady despite the gravity of the situation. "We must find out who among us had the means and motive to commit such a heinous act." Mr. Crane, visibly shaking, nodded in agreement. "Detective Beckett," he said, his voice betraying a hint of fear. "We must investigate this matter thoroughly. We cannot allow a killer to remain among us." With a solemn nod, Detective Beckett began his investigation, questioning each guest and searching for clues that might reveal the identity of Mr. Ford's killer. The The storm outside raged on, mirroring the tumultuous emotions within Crane Manor as suspicion cast a long shadow over the remaining guests. Hours passed as Detective Beckett meticulously pieced together the puzzle, uncovering hidden motives and buried secrets among the guests. Mrs. Evelyn Banks was revealed to have a bitter rivalry with Mr. Ford, stemming from a scandalous affair that threatened to ruin her reputation. Professor Gregory Stone's obsession with ancient poisons and artifacts hinted at a darker knowledge that raised unsettling questions. Dr. Emily Hawthorne's interest in human behavior led her to scrutinize the interactions among the group, searching for subtle clues that might expose the killer's motives. Meanwhile, Mr. Thomas Reed's reclusive nature and mysterious past cast a shadow of suspicion over his every move, while Mrs. Maggie Dean's vast fortune and philanthropic endeavors raised questions of greed and hidden agendas. Miss Abigail Blight's haunting melodies and fragile demeanor hinted at a tragic past that might hold the key to understanding the events unfolding around them. As the night wore on, tensions reached a boiling point, each accusation and revelation pushing the guests closer to the brink of paranoia. The storm outside continued its relentless assault, its fury echoing the turmoil within Crane Manor. In the early hours of the morning, as the storm finally began to subside, Detective Beck gathered the guests in the parlor once more. His gaze swept over each face, his expression unreadable as he prepared to reveal the identity of Mr. Ford's killer. Ladies and gentlemen, he began, his voice commanding attention, the time has come to unmask the truth. Through careful investigation and astute observation, I have uncovered the one among us who is responsible for the murder of Jameson Ford. The guests held their breaths, their eyes fixed on Detective Beckett as he paused for dramatic effect. The killer, he continued, his voice steady and unwavering, is none other than... Suddenly the lights flickered once more, plunging the room into darkness. A moment of confusion and panic followed, voices raised in protest and fear as the guests groped in the darkness for answers. When the lights flickered back on, Detective Beckett lay sprawled on the floor, a crimson stain spreading across his chest. Shocked gasps filled the room as the guests recoiled in horror, their eyes wide with disbelief. "Detective Beckett!" Mrs. Maggie Dean cried, rushing to his side with trembling hands. "Who could have—" But before she could finish her sentence, a cold voice cut through the air, a voice filled with triumph and malice. "I couldn't allow him to expose me," Mr. Crane declared, stepping forward with a chilling smile. He was getting too close to the truth. It had to be done. The guests stared at Mr. Crane in stunned silence, the pieces of the puzzle falling into place with sickening clarity. He had invited them to this mansion under false pretenses, orchestrating a deadly game of deception and betrayal. "I killed Jameson Ford," Mr. Crane admitted, his gaze sweeping over the room with cold indifference. "And I killed Detective Beckett to ensure my secret remained buried. And now I'm going to kill all of you." With a roar of outrage, Professor Gregory Stone lunged at Mr. Crane, his fists raised in fury. The two men grappled in a desperate struggle, crashing into the furniture as chaos erupted around them. Dr. Emily Hawthorne seized the opportunity to call the local authorities on her cell phone, her voice urgent as she reported the murders and requested immediate assistance. As the police sirens wailed in the distance, Mr. Crane was subdued and restrained, his reign of terror brought to a dramatic end. The remaining guests huddled together in shock and relief, their hearts heavy with the weight of the night's horrors. In the days that followed, the residents of Harborview whispered about the events that had unfolded at Crane Manor, a tale of murder and betrayal that had shattered the illusion of civility and trust among the town's elite. Detective Beckett was mourned as a hero, his dedication to justice remembered by all who had witnessed his final act of bravery. Mr. Crane was swiftly brought to trial, his crimes exposed to the harsh light of public scrutiny. As for the guests who had survived that fateful night, they carried with them scars that would never fully heal. The bonds forged in fear and suspicion had forever altered their lives, a reminder that beneath the facade of wealth and privilege lay darkness waiting to be unleashed. And so, as the sun set over Harborview on the 4th of July, the echoes of that tragic night lingered in the air, a cautionary tale of how even the brightest celebrations could be marred by shadows of deceit and murder.